and the effect that it has on citizens of every faith and even those of no faith whatsoever. Our speaker tonight is the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor in the Humanities. I'm reading this stuff because it's a mouthful, and that is because she's done amazing things that I'm just going to touch on. But the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at WashU. She's also editor of that organization's journal, Religion and Politics. Her research focuses on American Christianity, including the changing profiles of evangelicals and particularly the conflicts there over gender, sexuality, and marriage. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia and also Harvard. Before moving to WashU, she was a professor at Princeton and later at Harvard. She has either written or edited a total of 7 different books, some of which she'll be referencing this evening, and has received so many academic awards that if I listed all of them off, you wouldn't get to hear from her, which I know is the reason that you're here. So please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Marie Griffith.
That was so lovely. Thank you so much. I am truly honored to be here. The Danforth Center, Barbara reminded me, we co-sponsored an event with you all several years ago, Sandra Fluke, when we brought her to Graham Chapel on the WashU campus. But I'm just delighted to be back here and want to thank Barbara in particular, as well as Laura here, saving the tech. I guess I'll just keep talking while you do that. Is that okay? I just need to put a couple things down here.
I don't know why it's not on you. I don't know. Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I see us here.
Right, because they're,
Whoops. Well, go ahead.
well,
We'll figure it
just
out.
to say a couple of preliminary things. I just admire Women United so very much, Women's Voices United. And I want to announce, this hasn't been announced publicly yet, but this happens to be my final semester as the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. I'm returning to the faculty and a much needed long banked leave year to work on my next book project. Which is actually on the clergy abuse crisis in American Christianity and the U.S. Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention. It's been a joy running the center, but one of the nice things about no longer running the center is that I can be less neutral than I've sort of been required to be in my role. And so I look forward to being on that side of the podium and doing a lot of things with you all and being more me than I've really been able to do, sometimes being restrained in my role. So thank you. So the topic I was asked to speak about tonight is extremism and how it is eroding our rights, women's rights. I would add people of color's rights, children's rights, American rights more broadly, including men's rights. We live in a deeply troubled time. And we are indeed drenched in extremism. I am very glad to talk about all of this with you. And I'm going to try not to talk for too terribly long because I want us to have a conversation and to be able to answer your questions about that. And I really don't think I need to stand up here and lecture you all on how extremism is eroding our rights. I think you know, if you pay attention to legitimate news sources, and if you're here tonight, I'm certain that you do, then you see the extremism, the white Christian nationalism, the greedy selfishness of our politics, the violence that is infecting and even driving some of our religions, the fetishization of guns. You see it in our, I've got reverb here. That's okay. You get to hear me twice. You see it in our national politics where political actors such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, Josh Hawley and Marsha Blackburn are now mainstream and astonishingly electable. and where Kevin McCarthy so profoundly craves the power of the speaker's chair that he would hold up the House's business for a week and undergo a historic and humiliating 14 election losses before squeaking it out on the 15th. You see extremism in our state politics, where the Missouri House of Representatives has just spent our time, which is our tax dollars, policing the fashion choices of female legislators and staff. The vote last week was 105 to 51, wasn't even close, not even close to close. And I just when I was sitting here waiting to be called up, I checked the St. Louis Post-Dispatch headlines, and there's another headline in there tonight about how they're now going to address critical race theory again. Far worse, our state ranks at the top in terms of weak gun laws. There are no background checks required for unlicensed gun sales. People, I know you know, are allowed to carry hidden loaded handguns in public places, whether they have a permit or not, whether they've even had a minute of safety training or not, doesn't matter. Even domestic abusers are freely allowed to possess guns. You also see extremism, and I mean both the religious and the political kind, which are deeply intertwined, in our school boards, which are being stacked with conspiracy theorists who think that having white teenagers read literature such as Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye will scar them for life, rather than teach them some truths about racism that we all need to know. You know, I have blue eyes, and I well remember reading The Bluest Eye in a college literature class by first year of college. And it was a profoundly important experience for me. It was absolutely pivotal for me in recognizing that I was part of a racist society. And though it wasn't through some original sin of my own, still, I had to make a choice about whether to shrug at the racism or to care and to act about it. I mean, it was not some devastating experience that made me collapse and condemn my parents and all these things it's getting accused of. And finally, you saw extremism. We all saw it on January 6, 2021, when a sizable mob of men and women essentially sought to overturn the US government. And they were cheered on by countless numbers, not just the likes of Holly, but by countless numbers of our fellow citizens in all 50 states in our country. We get a bad rap as Missouri, and maybe deservedly so, but this is everywhere, as we know. Extremism is a poison that we are all forced to breathe, to ingest in every cell of our body. Most of us here tonight, I dare say, are outraged and horrified and also terrified of the extremism that's so powerful today. And we're also distraught for our children and our children's children who will have to deal with this reality long after we're gone. I don't think I need to tell you about this. We've got many stories to share, all of us, about it. Now, some of you may want me to say something about extremism on the left as well as the right. There are many people, mostly Republican, but also some Democrats, who say that the left is just as beset by extremists as the right. And I must honestly tell you that I do not agree with this claim. There is certainly robust disagreement among progressives and liberals and folks on the sort of left generally about what kinds of issues should predominate, what kinds of candidates we should run. You know, remember how long it took to get to Biden, and there was a lot of heartbreak over that. And a fight lies ahead for who the Democrats are going to nominate in 2024, right? So there's a lot of conflict, but I don't see it as extremism, but as genuine policy disagreements among people who are generally in agreement in that they favor equal rights for all Americans. They're united in that. They may disagree on how to get there or how fast to push to get there. The extremists on the right are not generally in favor of equal rights for all Americans. That's the difference. They seem to believe, most do, that some citizens should have significantly more rights and more privileges than others. And that, it seems to me, is really what we're talking about when we talk about extremism, a difference between those who really want equal rights for all and are working toward that, want to work toward that, and those who genuinely do not want that. So no, I'm not going to talk about purported extremism on the left, because to the extent that it exists, it's in no way like the existential threat that extremism on the right presents. Now, argue with me afterwards if you want to, but that's just my own point of view. So the question that I hear over and over again in any setting like this, in which we're analyzing extremism and trying to get to the bottom of it, is what can we do? Right? This is, Barbara, you told me at the end, this is kind of the big question you all want to talk about. This is countless numbers of us are asking this question. What can we do? Everyone, who cares is trying to think about that. And I think when we ask the question, we're not looking for easy answers or pat answers or just quick fixes. We know that's more difficult. But we really want to make the world better. That's how I see it, is that people are really wanting to find ways that they in their own small place in the world can make the world better. Now, that is a very lofty goal. And a lot of good intentions have ended up in very bad places in US history, as you know. There's a haunting scene from The Handmaid's Tale. How many of you have read it or watched the TV series? Okay. That's Margaret Atwood's celebrated dystopian novel about the US becoming this sort of radical totalitarian fundamentalist Christian society that's built on the subjugation of women, right? Well, Commander Waterford in this one scene, who's one of the architects of that new society, he's in a conversation with his handmaid, Offred, on why the rules against women are so brutal and violent. And in the televised adaptation of this scene, he defends himself to her and he says, "We only wanted to make the world better." Better? She splutters in disbelief. There's just been a genital mutilation of a woman who was discovered to be a lesbian. And he just coldly answers, "Better never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some." So US history is filled with examples of well-intentioned efforts to make the world better that in retrospect we can say really was good only for the few, perhaps, and profoundly destructive to many others, going back to the early explorations of this continent by Europeans. They made the world better themselves, coming here in many ways, but they made the world a lot worse for those they displaced, as we know. Now, some of you may have heard me say in the past that I think no thinker has probed these issues more deeply than James Baldwin. And I'm not going to say everything I want to say about James Baldwin, except please read him if you haven't, or watch the amazing documentary of him, whose name is escaping me, but I'll come up with it. And he said, basically, it's not just about making the world better. He wrote, "We made the world we're living in. We have to make it over." And so making the world over, I have found to be a very powerful way of thinking about all of this. And so this is the most recent book that I made. I titled it "Making the World Over, Confronting Racism, Misogyny, and Xenophobia in US History." And I just want to talk a little bit about those three issues as they relate to extremism. And then I want us to have a lively discussion about what we can do. And I want everyone to leave our discussion with more hope about the future than we had this morning. So I'm talking about tough things, and I know that, but you all give me hope. There is so much to give us all hope, and I do want to leave us with that. But first, just to talk a little bit about racism. I think you all know this, that the earliest American historical narrative that most children learn in school, certainly that I did, was one of the benevolent pilgrims crossing the ocean and enjoying the delicious meal and, all of that, and a very kind of glossy image of so much of early American history, right up into the present. Now, things are getting better on that case, we know, and I think my children certainly had a much fuller education in American history than I did. But there is a pernicious ignorance still about slavery in the US and its pernicious effects in structural racism in our own time. 12.5 million African persons were sent to the New World from Africa, 12.5 million. Many of them died en route, to the New World. By the time of the Civil War, I think there were something, the estimate is there were around 3 million slaves in the United States alone. We don't know these numbers. If you had asked me the numbers 2 years ago, and I'm, an academic, I didn't know those numbers. And I bet most of you don't know the numbers. So there's still a lot that I think we need to reckon with, and with the longer impact of all of that. Now, scholars, as you know, are doing that. Teachers in schools are doing that. They've called it revisionist history. Do you remember when revisionist history was sort of the big controversy? Okay, same thing. Now they're calling it critical race theory, which it is not. But this is the sort of, resistance and reaction against telling our kids, our white kids, the story of slavery, the true color of slavery, and learning that the ideology of racism, as historians now see, the ideologies of racism were basically created to justify the enslavement of Blacks by whites, right? And, this included theologies that, Christian theologies of the South, which is where I'm from Tennessee, essentially taught that this was God's will. Slavery was God's will. God intended the races to stay separate. All these kinds of views. So Christian children were brought up just believing that this was the God, this was the way things were. And I think white Christians need to dispense with the wish that our religion has been free of racism and white nationalism. And I sometimes think, some of us, I've seen some chastisements lately of more liberal Christians to realize that it's not just the conservative Christians on this. There's a lot to account for in the liberal Christian tradition as well. Now, it's, of course, easy to see why these painful truths about slavery and racism and all of it makes people anxious. But we've got to be able to have these conversations. There was a recent survey of high school students done in 2017 by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I'm sure many of you know of. And they discovered that only 8% of high school seniors knew that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War, because, people didn't want to tell them that. There's been a revision of, what the true causes were. Teachers showed profound unease in this study, around the subject of slavery, around teaching it. Even when they said it was important to them to teach it, they were very uncomfortable and didn't really know how to teach it. And these researchers concluded from this study that teachers tend to, this is a quote, present the good news before the bad, and indeed the good news in lieu of the bad. So they teach children about the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass, and white abolitionists, the Emancipation Proclamation, the feel-good stories, the important feel-good stories. They're true stories, they're important stories, but they're not the whole story. They're not, they're not teaching about the slave system itself or its legacies in racist structures that, permeate our own time. The report noted, this is another quote, "We tend to subscribe to a progressive view of American history that can acknowledge flaws only to the extent that they have been addressed and solved. Our vision of growing ever more perfect stands in the way of our need to face the continuing legacy of the past." And so that's just a really critical thing that I'd be glad to say more about afterwards, but that's sort of one of the themes that I've increasingly felt was just absolutely crucial to address, and obviously a key part of our politics and our political divisions and polarization today. Now, just a few brief words about xenophobia also. So fear or hatred of the foreigner, this is the root meaning of xenophobia. This is as deep a part of US history as is racism. Most Americans today know that there were deep wells of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment in 19th century America, and also anti-Semitism as more Jews came over, anti-Italian attitudes, anti-almost any group that started to come in large numbers in the 19th and 20th century. A lot of anti-Asian anti-Chinese. Of course, we've had Chinese exclusion acts in our history that really targeted ethnic groups and forbade them from coming to this country. So, and actually the visual depictions from the late 19th, early 20th century are just, they're so horrifying. I no longer really show them in these talks. They show the Irish being portrayed as apes, stealing elections. They're dead drunk all the time. Foreigners were essentially painted as bringing new and terrible things into the country, the desecration of the Sabbath, anarchy, pagan religions, disease, and poverty. So all along, there have been critics who believed U.S. immigration policy was far too lenient and needed tightening. This is not, just a recent thing. So there have always been those who don't like the changes that have been wrought by immigrants, or the changes they fear will be wrought by them. And of course, this is a crucial theme in our own time. And I see this also as a form of extremism. One of the things that I started thinking about when I was writing that last book were the values that I think it may take for us to face some of these. So the chapter on racism and slavery, I talk a lot about truthfulness, the need to really confront, truthfully our history, the beautiful parts included. I think oftentimes the critique is that folks who have this view only want to present America as the damned nation. And at least that is certainly not my view at all. I want us to find the heroic moments, the heroic people, and be inspired by them. But I don't want that to be the only story that children are taught, because it's a rude awakening, usually when they get to college classes and discover that all was not as it seemed. And then I think sometimes professors are frustrated and maybe do only tell the negative story. That's part of it, I think, in my world. When it comes to xenophobia and fear of the stranger, I thought a lot about empathy and tried to really, address this kind of very complicated emotion of empathy, which can come off as very patronizing. I mean, there's a lot of problems, I think, with empathy. Imagining that we truly understand what it's like to be another person when we can never truly understand what it's like, but we can do our best to imagine into their economic conditions and their life stories and find empathy. So we can talk more about that also, because I think religious and political extremism have played a huge role throughout our history in this kind of anti-immigrant anger and really outrage. But I want to turn now, just finally, for a few final minutes, to misogyny, which is a topic I think might particularly interest many of you. Women's equality, of course, has been at the center of our culture wars really since the battles over women's suffrage started in the 19th century, and really before that. But, my purview kind of goes to about there. Gender has been a core concern in virtually all of the major dividing issues in subsequent years since slavery. So it was central to the birth control movement, arguments over censorship of literature. The Kinsey report said the 1950s, the female volume, if you know that history, created so much outrage that women were actually, more of them were having sex outside of marriage than the sort of social norm allowed. All of the issues of our own time, and certainly abortion, which I'm going to say more about in a moment, have had greatly to do with gender. And I am very interested in what I think of as the protracted reign of misogyny in American life. But I want to talk about misogyny because we think we know what that word means. And I learned recently that I really did not, or I hadn't thought as deeply about it. So I want to commend this book to you as well. This is by a philosopher, Kate Mann, but it's very readable. She's not writing in jargon. And the book is called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. And here she critiques the notion that misogyny is an emotion or a sort of individual person's psychological state, or that it is hatred of all women purely because they are women. Those cases exist, she knows, and she names some of them. But she feels like when we only think of that as misogyny, we miss a lot more. So she argues misogyny is better thought of as a powerful set of enforcement mechanisms that punish women who go against the rules of patriarchy and reward women who are compliant. So in her mind, just as there's structural racism in society, there's also structural sexism, and misogyny is kind of the apparatus that holds that in place, the coercive apparatus. It's the hostility women face when they refuse to perform their traditional gender roles. And in this sense, this isn't just about men enforcing those rules, it's about other women enforcing those rules. And that's what I find most helpful and explanatory. Just kind of a light bulb went off for me when I read that. So misogyny is not, this emotion, and it's not just men are misogynists and women are the victims. It's really like, no, this is sort of the air that we breathe, that we were raised in. And if you care about those issues, you kind of have to retrain yourself not to gossip about other women, what they wear, how their hair looks, this one works outside the home. This is a stay-at-home mom, so you know what that's like, all the little things. And when I read that book, I suddenly recognized myself in a lot of these kinds of policing sorts of practices. I could not recommend her book more to you. She's had a second book come out since then, and honestly, I haven't gotten to it yet, but I know this one is just a really great one. So at its extreme, misogyny is the world of The Handmaid's Tale, and it's enforced through torture and all kinds of things, but it's really a spectrum with a lot of subtler forms as well. The sort of, I've already named some of these, and we can talk more about this here because I know this is a subject of tremendous interest to you all. So it's belittling, it can come sexualizing women or desexualizing them, right? It's sort of putting women in their place when they don't conform to what we want them to be in a certain kind of way. And so women have participated in this, I think, just as much as men. Now, I could say a word about movements for women's rights, the backlashes against them. All of this has to do with extremism. Again, I feel like you all know a lot of that, and I don't really want to lecture you on things that you're already knowing about. But I think if there's sort of an unbroken theme that structures women's history, it is the wrath and the backlash that's visited upon women and others who have in one way or another dared to challenge the hierarchical social order in some way. And we see that over and over again. And maybe that's a good segue. You didn't ask me to talk about this, but I thought I'd say just a few words about the Dobbs decision last summer, the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And I want to say at the outset that Americans hold a wide range of views on abortion. And I am someone who really wants to respect that. And I have a chapter on abortion in here where I try to write about how we could have better conversations about that, that aren't demonizing of people who hold points of view other than our own. But we do know that Americans, a sizable majority of Americans believes and has long believed that abortion should be accessible to women in certain circumstances. And where we differ are what we believe are appropriate circumstances. Are they all circumstances completely left over to women? Many women and men believe that. Others say, no, I don't think it's just for all time, but here are circumstances in which I can tolerate it. And so few and far between, actually, as it turns out, are those who believe it should never be available no matter what. And that's true among Catholics just as much as anyone else. And yet the Dobbs decision allows state legislatures, as we know, to criminalize all abortions and prosecute providers and patients and probably those who assist them. We're going to see if some of these new regulations stand in the courts or not. So there's a lot to say about this, but I just wanted to call your attention to the extraordinary dissent that was penned by Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. If you haven't read that dissent, and it's not very long, I really urge you to read it. It is an amazing piece of literature. It's an amazing piece of writing that is all about misogyny And the misogyny, I think that they point out, they don't say it in these words, but of that Dobbs decision and the sort of assumptions behind it. It's all about abortion as a fundamental necessity for gender equity. So I just want to quote a couple of things and then I'll conclude so we can have enough discussion. They write, for half a century, Roe and Planned Parenthood have protected the liberty and equality of women. Respecting a woman as an autonomous being and granting her full equality meant giving her substantial choice over this most personal and most consequential of all life decisions. And they press the point as the dissent goes on. They say, after today, young women will come of age with fewer rights than their mothers and grandmothers had. The majority accomplishes that result without so much as considering how women have relied on the right to choose or what it means to take that right away. The majority's refusal even to consider the life-altering consequences of reversing Roe and Casey is a stunning indictment of its decision. And the final thing, they take issue with each of the individual concurrences that the conservative majority wrote. You know, each justice wrote his own concurrence with the decision. And Kavanaugh's they find particularly irksome because you too, because he says that the Dobbs decision in his dissent, he said, this is neither pro-choice nor pro-life. It is scrupulously neutral, he wrote, by returning abortion to the states. And these dissenting judges retort to that. If I can pull my pages apart. When the court decimates a right women have held for 50 years, the court is not being scrupulously neutral. It is instead taking sides against women who wish to exercise the right and for states that want to bar them, they want to bar them from doing so. Justice Kavanaugh cannot obscure that point by appropriating the rhetoric of even-handedness. His position just is what it is, a brook no compromise refusal to recognize a woman's right to choose from the first day of pregnancy. And that position cannot be squared with this court's longstanding view that women indeed have rights to make the most personal and consequential decisions about their bodies and their lives. So in other words, to my mind, the dissenting judges in that dissent accuse the conservative majority of extremism, right? The kind that's eroding all of our rights. So I highly recommend that document to you as an inspiration, as a frustration, but also an inspiration. So just to conclude, I want to return to the preoccupying question of what can we do to counter extremism? Obviously, none of us can tackle the full range of extremism nationally or even locally on our own. I do think part of what we can do daily is to practice the values that we know are critically important for our collective right together. And for me, these are core values of truthfulness, of empathy, as I spoke of. And when it comes to misogyny, it's courage is sort of what I meditate on. You know, the courage to stand up, the courage to find the places where I have done misogynistic things and I have upheld that and learned to refuse to do that and correct myself, right? The courage to stand up for others when you see it happening. Just the courage to do, and you all exemplify this. So I don't mean to sound like a lecturer here at you, but I think these are values we know that run deep in the texts and the traditions of religious traditions, philosophical traditions, including secular humanism and other secular philosophies. And in literature, like the works of Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and others whose books are being banned all around us. For decades, the nation's culture has been battered by extremist forces that directly oppose these values in politics and in other social arenas, right? So events have been driven not by truthfulness, but by willful deceit. It's happening every day around us, not by courage, but by cowardice, and not by empathy, but by indifference to the needs of others. That feels closer to at least a good sizable segment of our political culture today. And all of these factors, to me, have made the world worse for most of us, although they may have made it better for some. to see that. So as James Baldwin said so many years ago, he said, we must start by telling as much of the truth as we can bear. But we cannot stop there. Instead, we must then tell a little more and more and more until we realize that the atrocities of history can be faced. And indeed, they must be if they are to be changed. This was the urgent and fundamental challenge that Baldwin saw for all of us, is to face those fears, confront the history, and seek out the best in our religious, our philosophical, our literary and artistic traditions. And then we can begin to shape new visions and new ideals for our lives and for the future and new worlds. And then it's up to us to build them. So I will stop there. Thank you. And I'd love to have your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can we just put a little structure around Q&A and questions? Laura's going to share questions that have come up in the chat from those who are watching online. Is that accurate? Okay. And we have a microphone in the center aisle if you have a question that you'd like to bring to our speaker. One little caution. We know from experience that women's voices members are informed and passionate and opinionated. And so when you come to the microphone, please remember that we'll have lots of time after the meeting to talk to one another and address questions to the speaker. And a question means a group of words that end with a question. Thank you.
So Laura, you're going to read any questions that come on the Zoom then, is that right? Okay, wonderful. Yes.
Perhaps I should be embarrassed to admit that I just learned a term this week called homophily, which undoubtedly you're familiar with.
I'm not sure I am. What is that?
Homophily, Homophily, is essentially birds of a feather flock together.
Ah.
And that how that's embedded in Homo sapiens, you know, how we beat up other species by being able to work communicate groups and blah, blah, blah. And it strikes me that that is very much embedded in religions and in that extremism. And in the question of how do we, I'm not going to go join that religion to try to infiltrate it, but how do we break that back? I think a lot of that comes from our childhood, how it's emotionally embedded in us, and it's where we feel comfortable. I went to an all-girls Catholic school with really smart women, and I always wonder how can they still be in that church?
Yeah.
And they are, and they're smart still, and they're fighting for women's rights. And I'm like, don't leave that church. But that's not the answer because that's too emotionally embedded. So how do we get to people make these decisions and they're like relatively right?
Right. That's a wonderful question. I'm going to repeat it for the people on Zoom so that you all can hear it too. But basically the question was, the term homophily sort of means people want to flock together. And we know that that's true. And so people tend to sort themselves out in religious communities and political affiliations, even neighborhoods. And we're not going to change human nature. So how do you sort of grapple with that and celebrate what I think is positive about that? People finding shared values, and that's part of the core of relationships, right? Is shared passions, shared ideals. But how does that affect our political polarization and sort of what to do? I mean, it's a beautiful question, and I think it is complicated. I think, you know, to my mind, the answer is, you know, we sort of have to balance, because I don't want to do away with that in my life or yours. You know, I think that when the like-minded, when it's, you know, ideals, you can really support each other, you know, and I'm thinking of it in the positive way. On the other hand, you know, there's QAnon conspiracy theorists. I'm sure they flock together too, right? So I'm not saying it's inherently good to flock together, but I think there can be real strength and value in that. But, you know, if we only do that, you know, I have felt so fortunate my whole career to teach on college campuses, because they are genuinely one of the more diverse spaces. They're not diverse enough, and they never have been and probably never will be, but they do bring students together who have had all different kinds of upbringings and backgrounds. and they're forced to live together in a dorm and kind of hash it out. We sort of need a version of that, in real life, and a real commitment to it. Some of you may know there's an organization called Better Angels. I think they changed their name. It's Better something. Braver Angels. You're right. Yeah. Braver Angels. And there is a group in St. Louis, I think, that's run by, I'll think in a moment, a colleague of mine at WashU. It brings people together intentionally to talk across those lines. Now that's, limited in a way because it's people who have agreed they want to do that, but you have to start somewhere. And I think that organization has had great success. So that might be something to look at, the Braver Angels organization. But I think even just the fact that you're asking the question, that we all care about that question and want to try and cross those boundaries, is really important. But, even at WashU, I find that a lot of the events that I've run over these past 12 years since being director of the center, I've often lamented that we seem to be preaching to the choir on a lot of things. So clearly I haven't thought my way out of that problem either. Did you have your hand up? Oh.
Okay, so there's a lot of things I don't understand. But one of them is the whole idea of people who are so afraid of the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are so afraid of the stranger seem to me to be heavily embedded in religious fundamentalism, where if they went to their foundational text, they would find the phrase, welcome the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over.
Mm-hmm.
How can anybody bridge that gap between what is actually in the text and what people are actually learning?
Yes. So this is a question about many things. There's layers to that question, but hardly when Christians don't read their own text or adopt it, in this case, the specific example being welcoming the stranger and having such fear of the stranger. And I think that's a manifestation of white Christian nationalism, is a manifestation of that in many ways. This question just bedevils me, Barbara. I have an evangelical background. I was raised Southern Baptist. I like to tell people I was raised the sort of Jimmy Carter type of Southern Baptist. So it was very religious, very Bible oriented, but also it was oriented toward helping others. Nobody ever preached against homosexuality or anything else from the pulpit. No one talked politics. People held pretty conservative views on a lot of things. There was no doubt, but they didn't see that as core to their faith. They saw helping others, loving, serving others as the core of their faith. And that branch of Southern Baptists, some of you may know this history, really got driven out in the 1970s and 80s, literally, as the seminaries were taken over by fundamentalists. And there's a whole story about how that happened. So my whole family is out, those Southern Baptists, they left. They either left Christianity entirely or went to another denomination on the whole. And so what, we are left with on that conservative side, certainly among the Southern Baptists, tend to be, I think a lot of folks who do see welcoming the stranger in some way, but they don't translate that maybe out, into immigration policy necessarily, right? But I would have to say it bedevils me too, because I think there's a lot more like Jesus's, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, that seem to have completely dropped out of the canon among a lot of Christians of that ilk. And it pains me because I felt like I got a lot from my Christian background, and I discarded much of it as an adult, but there was a lot of good that I got, and that it feels like it's been, sort of really poisoned by a lot of that. So I don't have an answer for you, except you're right, that I think there's a real problem. People have always picked and selected from their texts. I think that's just true. People choose the parts that are most important to them. But when it feels like key messages of the entire tradition that have been sloughed away, I think that's a tragedy.
Okay, we have a question from Nancy. She says the term white privilege was coined by a female professor at Wellesley who studied and taught male privilege and wondered if there was a racial version of male privilege.
Wait a minute. Could you say that again? I didn't understand it.
She says the term white privilege was coined by a female professor at Wellesley who studied and taught male privilege and wondered if there was a racial version of male privilege.
A racial version of male privilege. I don't know. I don't honestly know. I mean, there, you know, is it that, has there been patriarchy in the African-American tradition? Most definitely, if that's the question. I'm not sure that's what she's asking though, but there has certainly been, you know, as people will tell you, you know, a patriarchy issue in African-American history, if that's the question. I don't know. Yeah, but thank you.
Okay, BC asks, what suggestions do you have to address the extremism and disinformation that spreads so widely on social media?
You know, I would be a billionaire if I had the answer to that, because I think, I'm sorry, I should repeat the question, shouldn't I? So that was the question about what can we do about the lies and the misinformation and the intentional misinformation throughout social media. Yeah, it's terrifying, and I think very, you know, politically devastating. And if you're a, you know, Twitter user, which I am, you know, Elon Musk doesn't seem to have made any of that better yet. And everyone's sort of watching to see his next step on some of that. I don't know. It's very, very difficult. I mean, I really think the legislators, I think it's going to take laws, you know, that really enter in. I don't know who the legal thinkers are that are trying to think about that. I mean, people get so stymied by free speech and, you know, academic freedom, you know, on campus, which are crucial concepts, but that doesn't mean certain things can't be regulated. We're regulated in all areas of our lives where we've agreed on what is impermissible. And so I'm just not the right thinker to think through that problem, but I certainly agree with the person who asked that question that it's a huge problem.
In the Supreme Court case, Kennedy versus Bremerton, the Supreme Court decided or ruled that it is okay for a coach to pray on the 50-yard line of a public school district. And I was just wondering if you saw any connections to religious fundamentalism in that, or just view it as a strictly separation of church and state issue.
Yeah, thank you. No, the question is about the decision, the Supreme Court decision allowing the coach to pray on the sidelines and, you know, what relation that has to these broader issues. I do see these as very interconnected. I mean, it feels like, to me, I guess the way I would answer that is, I think the meaning and definition of religious freedom has changed dramatically with the current court, and maybe not only starting with the current court, but starting with very conservative legal thinkers, you know, 50 years ago who were working in this direction and then, you know, became very powerful in the courts. So these are, you know, religious freedom. At one time, you know, folks were much concerned with religious minorities and making sure that they had the same rights as the religious majority had. And now it feels like all the religion cases the court keeps taking really are about religious majorities being able to, in my view, impose their religion on religious minorities or on secular people in new ways. So it's, you know, when that decision came down, I have to tell you guys this. I'm not bragging. This is just the coolest thing that ever happened in my life. Nina Totenberg wanted to talk to me. I was like, I can retire now because nothing better will ever happen. So I had like a half-hour Zoom call with Nina Totenberg. And it was just amazing. But she, as many of you know, has been at this. She studied the Supreme Court for decades. Like, she is an expert, you know, par excellence, right? And she was so demoralized. I mean, she just said, you know, and we talked about this issue of religious freedom and how it's just been completely reinterpreted. And to my mind, dramatically distorted. And how do we stop that? You know, how do we, you know, where is that happening? I am not a lawyer. And I feel like so much of what needs to happen now needs to happen in law schools and, you know, among lawyers willing to fight those fights. But I appreciate you raising the question, because I do see that as a key part of what is supporting extremism and also fanning the flames of it at the same time.
National monuments,
Mm.
both sides.
Oh, sure. Sure. Yeah, national monuments. Yeah, my husband should be here because he's teaching a class. He teaches classes on those things. So he's probably the better expert on that than I am. But I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, as you noted. And so, you know, that's where Charlottesville happened in 2017, all of the, you know, and that was about the removal of statues, the statue of Robert E. Lee in the, you know, town park, and the Thomas Jefferson statue that's been there for, you know, centuries, was covered up. It's been defaced. You know, the UVA has been kind of this, a core place for these debates, and Charlottesville more generally. I am someone who believes that it's time to remove the Confederate monuments. And I am a Southerner, but I had no attachment to the Confederacy. My father's side of the family was pro-Union up in Upper East Tennessee. So I never had that kind of fuzzy feeling about the Confederacy. But, you know, I do believe in the world that we live in and what those Confederate monuments mean. That it's time to retire them. Now, do I think they should be in a museum about Confederate monuments and the Confederacy? Absolutely. The last thing I want is for us to forget that history, right? As I said earlier, I want us to understand and remember all of the parts of our history. So I don't think they should be destroyed necessarily. Certainly not all of them should be destroyed, but I think they have no place, you know, in the town centers where they've been, you know, throughout the South and other parts of the country. There's like 6 Confederate monuments in California. There's a couple in Hawaii. So there, again, it's mostly the South, but other parts of the country that have kind of adopted a certain mindset, Minnesota, elsewhere, you know, have sort of had that celebratory nature too. So yeah, I'm very much in favor of removing them as sort of celebratory monuments. But I think they should be preserved and analyzed in a proper setting. Yes.
Oh, I've got one more on Zoom. So Jenny asks if you can share an example of something that you realized you were complicit in doing to support misogynistic structure after reading the book we talked about.
Darn it. Okay, Jenny, thank you. You're going to put me on the spot. So Jenny wants an example, a concrete example of what I realized that I had been doing, you know, to support these things. I mean, I think it's just, you know, I just thought about, I don't think I've done terribly egregious, you know, things, certainly not intentionally, but, you know, maybe, even internally, I think partly I realized internally, I think for us, and I hope you don't think I'm a horrible person, I hope you recognize maybe yourselves in this too, that you do judge things, whether you say it out loud or not. And I think I realized some of the things I was quietly judging, you know, and that itself was sort of a product, you know, and that itself was sort of misogyny in its own way, and that I needed to, you know, not participate in that. Or, you know, I've been a working mother my whole career. Okay, this is probably a more important one. I've been a working mother my whole career. And I used to live in Princeton for many years when my children were small. And there was the elementary school, it was kind of a divide between the working mothers, most of us teaching at Princeton University or Princeton Seminary, and then, you know, what we call the stay-at-home moms in their yoga pants and looking like, you know, their husbands were making a lot of money and we weren't. Well, we were catty about it. And I think they were catty about us in turn. And I just look back at that and I so regretted, you know, just the, you know, like, how could I have been that person who did that? And I wasn't trying to get to know them. I was just making assumptions. So it's that kind of thing that I think you really suddenly realize that something you thought was a joke is not funny. And that really you need to own up to that and be accountable to that and really, you know, dig deep in that. So thank you, Jenny, for the question. I hope you don't think I'm a horrible human being. But you know, I'm sure there's more I could tell, but that'll do for now. Oh, yes.
This afternoon, I was listening to some of the, they said about two of the education bills that they're trying to pass on parents' rights and curriculum. There's one part that, I was a former social studies teacher, some of the stories personally I proposed the bill, but there's one part in particular that sounds very good, benign, that every district should be required to have strong civics education. And I'm also a member of the League of Women Voters. We've talked about this, trying to get some good civics education. But as a part of that, here's how it's worded. Courses on patriotism and civic education. So my question would be, how would you define patriotism?
So the question is about how to define patriotism and relating it to the Missouri legislature, the things going on right now, and their version of what civics classes should be, right? Let me just say first, I don't know if you know Danielle Allen, but she's a scholar at Harvard, and I know her well and admire her greatly. She's done a lot, and she's on the progressive side of thinking, and she's leading some kind of initiative for civics education in the schools, and not driven by patriotism. But I've heard her speak, and she is trying to thread the needle here too and have this balance, like, because we know a lot of people are afraid that civics education will result in children hating America, whatever, you know, and so how to try to avoid that. And I think she's very thoughtful about that. And she's herself is African-American. She's written a lot more about slavery and other kinds of things, but she wants to try and really think through these complicated issues. But I mean, I guess, you know, patriotism is not really a word that I use on a daily basis, certainly, but it's certainly something, you know, like I remember 9/11, as we all do, and my reaction, and, you know, that week, and I remember going to church, actually, I was at a Methodist church that weekend, and what did they play? It was like, I don't know if it was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It was some hymn that I think a lot of churches played that, and I cried, you know, and it really was this sorrow that someone had attacked my country. And so I feel that, I know what that is. And, but I don't think it's a simplistic, everything America does is good. And I feel like that often gets, you know, misread, or just the controversy over the football players, Colin Kaepernick and the others, kneeling. You know, they weren't kneeling. They weren't, you know, thumbing their nose at the flag. They weren't defacing the flag. They weren't burning the flag. They were making a statement of you know, we're not there yet. You know, we're not there yet, and we have to be cautious about our patriotism. So I'm not giving you a very good answer. I'm sure you've thought about it a lot more than I have as a social studies teacher, and I commend you for that. But I do think it's very complicated, and trying to really teach, you know, I do think, you know, and many of us may have had this experience sometimes when I've traveled to other countries. I spent a semester in Kenya abroad as an undergrad, and I had been told Kenya was a democracy. And when I got there, it was a one-party democracy, and that doesn't exist. It was very repressive. And I had Kenyan people who, you know, under some fear, talked to me about that. And that kind of shifted my sense of America. I thought, okay, I think I've been taking it for granted, the democracy I do have, you know, the freedoms that we do have, that at least we're fighting for them. So that gave me also a reminder of, you know, what I do feel loyal to and devoted to about our ideals. And for me, it's the ideals. And the problem is we don't live up to our ideals over and over again. And that's humanity, right? That's not just the US. But I do feel, when I think and teach about kind of the ideals of our Constitution, ideals here, I can feel, you know, pretty happy about a lot of that. Not all of it, but, you know, a lot of that. I don't know. Does that make sense?
We are surprised a few minutes over time. How could we not be with such a compelling topic and such a compelling speaker. So first, thank you so much to Marie.
Thank you.
Are you able to stick around for a few minutes if people have individual questions that they want to pursue? And then just a quick moment of personal privilege, in addition to the amazing list of activities that Women's Voices has going on. Since one really core element of this extremism is certainly the current attack on women's reproductive rights, I wanted to first say, watch the news tomorrow for a big announcement. And second, and I'm not like being facetious, watch the news tomorrow. And also to let you know that on Sunday afternoon, the National Council of Jewish Women and a number of other organizations are sponsoring a photo exhibit about individual women sharing their own abortion stories, and also a panel discussion with a perspective from pre-Roe, during Roe, and now the post-Roe environment about women's reproductive rights. That's taking place at Congregation Sher Emeth on Ladue at 2:00 tomorrow afternoon. I'm sorry, yes, Sunday afternoon. Thank you. In the interest of safety, pre-registration is required and really will be enforced. The registration link is on the website for the National Council of Jewish Women. That's ncjwstl.org under events. And I think it's going to be a very compelling program because I'm talking about my own abortion back before it was legal. But other more interesting people than me are also talking. So it's just, I think, going to be a good foundation for how to start talking about these issues if we want to bring them to the foreground and have a chance of a groundswell of support for change. It has to come by talking about them. So thank all of you for, oops, yes, Barb.
I have a little minute.
Yes.
It was not said earlier, but it is important. And tonight's program was brought to you not only by Women's Voices, but by NCJW and the League of Women Voters and the Tuesday Women's Association of the Ethical Society, all progressive women's organizations. And we thank them for their publicity and their help.
Well, and all organizations who have figured out that it's way better to work smarter together than to work harder individually. So thank you for being part of that collaboration. And now I'll just turn it back over to all of you for your individual conversations and for pursuing more discussion with our speaker. And thank you for coming.
I didn't really share with the group, but on the misogyny question, I have 2 little grams on this, and it really made me think about when I read.
See your brain. Something you got started. Yeah. I've met you before, but it's been a long time.
Many times